In the bitter dark of Petrograd's winter, the snow fell in thick, choking silence, muffling the footsteps of murder. It was December 30th, 1916, and the Neva River lay beneath a frozen sheath, silent and waiting, in a palace wrapped in privilege and rot. They prepared the final sacrament for a man Russia could no longer abide. A man called Grigory Rasputin, healer, sinner, prophet. Pervert was to be slaughtered like a beast, but he would not go easily. They called him the Mad Monk, though he was neither monk nor mad in the way we understand it. He had long ago slithered out of the common categories men are sorted into. Rasputin had been a peasant mystic, a holy wanderer from Siberia who walked into the very heart of empire. He laid his filthy hands on the wounds of princes, whispered to queens in the dark, and drank with whores in the streets. He was a man of foul appetites and supposed miracles, God and flesh tangled so tightly, the threads could not be pulled apart without screaming. To kill him, they would need more than poison and bullets. They would need the hatred of a dying class. That night, Prince Felix Yusupov, a fragile aristocrat with a taste for theatrics, invited Rasputin to his palace under the pretense of casual indulgence. There were cakes, wine, and women's laughter echoing from somewhere above. The monk, already disoriented, perhaps suspecting nothing, perhaps suspecting everything, was led down into the cellar where the trap had been laid. Cyanide laced the pastries. Cyanide filled the wine, enough to kill a man 5 times over. But Rasputin kept eating and drinking and smiling. What were they thinking, watching him? Did they begin to fear him anew as the poison failed, as the grin curled tighter on his cracked lips, as his eyelids fluttered but did not close? Did they think he was immune or damned? Yusupov grew frantic. He retrieved a revolver and shot Rasputin point blank in the chest. The monk fell, finally his body twisting, mouth open in what might have been a prayer or a curse. For a moment, it seemed over. They celebrated upstairs, relief sharp in their champagne, until someone returned to check the corpse. The corpse was gone. Grigory Rasputin had risen. Some say he was crawling on hands and knees, blood slicking the floor, a trail of crimson leading from the cellar to the courtyard. Some say he looked his killer in the eye and whispered, "You bad boy, Felix," before lunging, a man riddled with cyanide and bullets, stumbling across the snow like something half-born, like a revenant made of frost and wrath. They shot him again, 3 more times. Still, his body would not submit. At last, they bound him, beat him, and dragged him through the cold toward the Neva. The river did not speak, but it accepted the offering. They threw him in, breaking the ice with the weight of their sin. When his body was retrieved days later, it bore marks of struggle. His arms were free of their bindings. His lungs held water. Rasputin had not been dead when they cast him in. He had drowned, gasping in that freezing black, staring up through the ice at a world that could not understand what it had created or what it had tried to destroy. There is something ancient in this kind of death, a mythic shape that echoes through time, the feared outsider who worms into the palace, who whispers too closely to the throne, and whose death must be not merely final but symbolic, operatic, excessive. A man must be erased in flesh and spirit, and yet Rasputin only grew more terrible in death. To understand the grotesque spectacle of that night, One must grasp what Rasputin had become. He was no longer a man but a wound on the Russian psyche. The empire, already shivering on its last legs, had made him its scapegoat, an avatar of every failure, every fear, every collapsing illusion of divine order. He was the smell of rot behind the curtain, the whisper in the holy silence, the wrong man in the right place. But this execution was not a triumph. It was the beginning of an unmaking. Rasputin's killers believed that with his death, the Romanovs could be saved, that the cancer could be cut out. Instead, his death unleashed a torrent. Within months, the Tsar would abdicate. Within a year, the entire royal family would be executed in a basement. The boy Rasputin had tried to heal would bleed no more because there would be no more blood left to spill. There is a photograph, still haunting, of Rasputin's corpse laid out on a wooden platform. His body, bloated from the river, stares at nothing. His face twisted, blackened, almost smiling. He is a man undone by prophecy and power. And yet, even then, he seems to mock the notion of finality. The Tsar was a god on earth. Rasputin made him a puppet. And now, the puppet master lay dead, and the gods would follow. Rasputin's final night is more than a death. It is a riddle wrapped in ice and blood. Why did he survive the poison? Why did the bullets fail? Why did it take drowning, that most ancient of punishments, to finally claim him? There are theories, some scientific, some supernatural. But perhaps the truth is simpler and crueler. You cannot kill a symbol with steel and arsenic. You must kill what made it necessary to exist. They failed, and in failing, they damned a dynasty. Before the snow turned red, before bullets broke the silence, there was light. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was born on a warm spring day in May 1868 in the golden cradle of Tsarskoye Selo. The sun filtered through silk curtains. Bells chimed for the birth of the heir, the son of Alexander III, the boy destined to sit on the world's most glittering throne. Russia rejoiced, blind to the blood that would one day soak that very soil. He was the last sovereign anointed by God. To understand the tragedy that followed, one must first see the innocence that preceded it. Nicholas was no tyrant in waiting. He was gentle, shy, dutiful. He loved poetry and uniforms, preferred long walks in the garden to court intrigues. In his diary, he wrote more about the weather than politics. He was not made to rule. He was made to obey. But history does not ask who is ready. It simply arrives. Nicholas came of age under the shadow of his father. Alexander III, a colossus of a man, both physically and politically. Alexander ruled with an iron will and iron fists, determined to stamp out revolution and preserve the divine autocracy. Nicholas idolized him but feared him too. When Alexander died suddenly in 1894, Nicholas, only 26, was thrust onto the throne, trembling beneath a crown too heavy for any man. He would later write, "I am not prepared to be a czar," yet the robes were thrown over his shoulders. The empire expected divinity, and the people, for a time, gave their love freely. At his coronation, they flocked in the hundreds of thousands. In Kodinka field, eager peasants surged forward for gifts and bread, and over 300 were trampled to death. Nicholas wept privately, but then attended a ball that night in glittering uniform. The contrast would become a theme, a man torn between mourning and protocol, sincerity and image. He ruled a land of ice and fire, an empire stretching from the palaces of St. Petersburg to the deserts of Central Asia. The Romanovs had ruled Russia for 3 centuries, claiming lineage from God, wielding the Orthodox Church and the secret police like twin scepters. But beneath the gold leaf, the floorboards were cracking when the peasants starved, the workers fumed, the intelligentsia plotted, revolution stirred, quiet and patient. And yet, for a time, Nicholas believed in the crown, in his blood, in the idea that history was his to command. He married for love, not alliance, a rarity in royal circles. Alexandra of Hesse, his German bride, was devout, delicate, and obsessive in her love for him. Together they seemed to embody a purer vision of monarchy, faithful, pious, united. Their palace was filled with music, laughter, and children, 4 daughters, each more radiant than the last Olga. Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and at last, in 1904, after years of prayer and fear, a son was born, the heir Alexei, a future Tsar. The dynasty's future seemed secure, but Alexei was born cursed. The disease was in the blood. Hemophilia, the royal plague, had stalked through Europe's noble houses for generations, passed quietly from mother to son, a legacy of Queen Victoria's tainted genetics. In Alexei, it bloomed like a dagger in silk. A bruise could mean death, a stumble, a hemorrhage. Behind every smile in the imperial portraits was the terror that the boy might not live to see the next sunrise. Nicholas and Alexandra were shattered. Publicly, they spoke of God's will. Privately, they wept in corridors, consulted mystics, and knelt in desperation. It was here, in the deepest vulnerability of the imperial soul, that a shadow began to creep across the golden rooms of their world. But for now, in this moment before the monk, before the war, before the collapse, we see Nicholas in his palace, holding his infant son, unaware that history is already tightening its noose. He is a man shaped by faith, by love, by centuries of inherited glory. A man who believed that God's hand still rested on the empire, and that if he only endured, all would be well. There is a bitter irony here, visible only in hindsight. Nicholas, the last son of Holy Russia, was not evil. But perhaps he was worse than evil, he was weak. And history, like the wolves of the Russian forests, does not forgive weakness. The seeds of his undoing were already sown in the blood of his son, in the rigid isolation of his beliefs, and in the blind obedience that led him to trust the wrong man at the worst moment. That man's name was Rasputin. The heir to the empire was born in pain and prophecy. On July 30th, 1904, in a bed lined with icons and fevered prayers, Tsarina Alexandra gave birth to a son. His name was Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, the long-awaited heir to the Russian throne, a divine answer to years of heartbreak and miscarriage. The joy in the palace was absolute. Cannons fired. Church bells sang across St. Petersburg. The Romanov line seemingly blessed once more. Now had its future in flesh and blood, but that blood was already flawed. Not a week after his birth, the bruises began. At first, they were small, a discoloration on the leg, a swelling at the elbow. But soon, the court physicians realized what the Empress feared: Alexei had hemophilia. A simple fall could cause his joints to balloon, his skin to blacken, his life to bleed out slowly and invisibly. A scrape could become a death sentence. There was no cure, only prayer and pain, The heir to a 1,000-year empire had inherited a bloodline that would not clot. Nicholas was crushed, but Alexandra, raised in the rigid Protestant mysticism of German nobility, sank into religious obsession. She saw in her son's illness not a disease, but a divine trial, a punishment, or perhaps a test. Her world narrowed to a single point: protect the boy at all costs. And that cost would soon become grotesque. Alexei's suffering was not abstract. It was intimate, physical, revolting. His joints would swell until they bulged grotesquely, his screams echoing through palace halls, enough to drive the servants mad. He would wake with blood in his pillow, his legs, at times, useless, his tiny body a battlefield of internal hemorrhages. In public, the child was presented with royal grace, dressed immaculately, always smiling. But behind closed doors, he was a creature of bruises and screams, and so the secret was kept. The court was sworn to silence. The empire could not know that its future czar was dying one wound at a time. Alexandra refused to allow the boy to be treated by regular doctors, convinced they could not see what was truly wrong. She began to believe that only holiness could save him. And then, as if conjured by that desperate faith, Rasputin arrived. The timing was uncanny. He was not summoned by court decree, but introduced through whispers, first as a peasant prophet, then as a healer. Alexandra had heard of him. Of course, everyone had. The monk with wild eyes and filth on his robes. A man who drank like a beast, rutted like an animal, but claimed visions from God. She met him once, and after that, nothing would be the same. Rasputin came to the boy's bedside during a particularly brutal episode. Alexei lay in fever, swollen, fading. The doctors had given up. Rasputin knelt, placed a hand on the child's forehead, and murmured strange prayers. He told Alexandra to remove the medications. He told her to believe. The next morning, the boy was improved. The swelling had gone down. The bleeding had stopped. It could have been coincidence, or shock, or the placebo effect. But to a mother who had watched her child suffer endlessly, it was a miracle, and miracles cannot be questioned. Rasputin became indispensable. He was summoned again and again through letters, through messengers, through desperate midnight prayers. And each time, when the child worsened, he would return, touch the boy, and somehow, whether by hypnosis, timing, or luck, the bleeding would slow. Alexandra no longer saw Rasputin as a man. He was God's instrument, a living saint. But saints are rarely beautiful. Rasputin smelled of sweat, of alcohol and earth. He bragged about the Tsarina's affections in brothels. He wrote her letters that reeked of blasphemy and erotic confusion. He once wrote, "My soul is linked to yours. God sees you as my beloved." And she, bound in her faith and fear, ignored the scandal and clung tighter. To Nicholas it was unbearable, but he said nothing. He trusted his wife. He could not face the disease. He turned away. He ruled on paper, but in spirit he began to disappear. Thus, a monk from the Siberian dirt became the shadow behind the throne. And the boy, poor Alexei, remained at the heart of it all. A fragile symbol of everything that must be preserved. His body, ravaged and shaking, became the justification for madness. His cries in the night echoed through decisions of state. Generals were fired because Rasputin willed it. Ministers replaced because Alexandra believed the monk had seen visions. The government of an empire was slowly reshaped around the suffering of one dying boy. There is something ancient in this cruelty. History is full of cursed heirs, of sickly princes whose illnesses twist the world around them. But Alexei's pain became political theology. It justified corruption. It excused insanity. And it brought a holy charlatan to the very peak of imperial influence. Even now, you can find the photographs. A child with large, sad eyes, always dressed in perfect naval uniforms, holding a flower, riding a sled, and you would never guess the agony beneath. That at night, his bones felt like broken glass, that he begged God to let him die, that his parents were sacrificing a kingdom to keep him breathing. This was the beginning of the rot. Not Rasputin, not war, not revolution, but a boy who could not stop bleeding and an empire that bled with him. He came from the black mud of Pokrovskoy, born in 1869 among horses' dirt, and silence, a peasant son of an unrecorded village. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was not educated. He could not read or write until adulthood. But he spoke with eyes that burned and a voice that turned stone to trembling. He wandered from monastery to monastery, never staying, never joining. The monks whispered that he was either a prophet or possessed. He called himself a stranic, a wanderer of the soul. Russia, in her twilight, was ripe for such men. The soil was holy, the air thick with mysticism, prophecy, and peasant superstition. In the countryside, miracles were not disbelieved, they were expected. In the cities, the upper classes decadent, sickened by wealth, and desperate for purpose fed upon the exotic, the spiritual, the ecstatic. Rasputin would give them all of it. He was Russia's symptom, not its disease. When he came to St. Petersburg around 1905, he was already wrapped in myth. Stories preceded him like incense. He had visioned the Virgin in the woods, fasted for weeks, healed children, seduced widows, and survived poison. His eyes were described again and again, enormous animal, glassy and wet like a fever dream. Some said he smelled like goat sweat and incense. Others that he radiated heat, like something barely human. He moved between parlors and convents, drawing in women of means and men of influence. He prayed for them, touched them. His hands stayed too long. His gaze lingered in places even confession could not name. He wept. He prophesied. He listened. Always he listened. And in a world drowning in noise and vanity, that made him holy. But it was Alexandra who gave him immortality. When she met him, her soul was already threadbare. The pressure of the crown, the shame of her German blood, the suspicion of the court, and above all, the unending terror of losing her only son had hollowed her. Rasputin walked into that void and filled it. She called him our friend, sometimes father. In her letters, she begged him to come quickly, to pray harder, to intercede with God. She truly believed that when Rasputin touched Alexei, the bleeding stopped, and perhaps it did. Whether through hypnosis, calm suggestion, or the sheer force of Alexandra's faith, Rasputin became part of the child's blood. He was now a thread stitched into the veins of the Romanov dynasty. And so, what began as healing became power. Not overnight, not openly, but steadily, like damp creeping under a door. The Tsar, already uncertain and withdrawn, came to rely on his wife for advice. She, in turn, relied on Rasputin. He advised not only on the boy's health but on church appointments, ministerial changes, court politics. He dismissed generals. He whispered suspicions. Those who opposed him found themselves removed, disgraced, exiled. He had no rank, no office, no uniform, but wielded more influence than anyone outside the throne itself. The aristocracy was horrified. The idea that a filthy peasant with a penchant for brothels and drunken binges could influence imperial policy was too much to bear. And it wasn't just rumor Rasputin was debauched. He would drink until he blacked out, then roam the streets babbling scripture. He bragged about his closeness with the empress. He was seen groping noblewomen, praying with one hand and fondling with the other. He believed that to sin was to know God more fully, and he was devout in his sinning. But Alexandra saw none of this, or rather, she saw and forgave. Or perhaps she believed he was persecuted like the saints of old. She once wrote, "Our friend is slandered as Christ was." Her world had shrunk to two things: her son's survival and Rasputin's grace. Everything else, the ministers, the war, the starving people, was distant noise. Even Nicholas, withdrawn and passive, came to accept the monk. Perhaps he hoped Alexandra would be calmer. Perhaps he believed in Rasputin's powers, or perhaps, like many, he feared him. Rasputin did not ask for permission. He entered the Tsar's presence in rags, smelling of vodka, and called him Nicky. He treated emperors like equals, because he believed himself to be God's true servant. And for a time, God obeyed. In 1912, Alexei suffered a life-threatening hemorrhage in the thigh. His leg swelled monstrously. The boy howled for death. The doctors prepared for the end. Alexandra, desperate, wired Rasputin, then traveling in Siberia. His response: "The little one will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him too much." Days later, the bleeding stopped. The boy lived. The empress wept. The country reeled. Was it a miracle, a coincidence, a fever breaking on its own? It did not matter. From that moment, Rasputin was no longer a healer. He was a pillar of the throne. The empire would stand or fall with him, and the people began to notice. Pamphlets spread, satirical cartoons, whispered tales in the markets and salons. They called Rasputin the Black Spider, the Holy Devil, the Mad Monk. They said he bedded the empress, that he fathered the heir, that he drank the blood of virgins and laughed in the face of Christ. Whether any of it was true had ceased to matter. Truth rotted beneath perception, and perception was fatal. The body of Russia had been wounded for years' poverty, repression, famine, war. But now, it had a face for its pain. Rasputin was no longer a man. He was a symbol of decay, of corruption, of sacred blood spoiled. He had claimed to heal with touch, but everything he touched now turned to ash. At first, they whispered, in salons choked with cigar smoke and envy, among silk-covered divans and gold-gilt mirrors. The nobles of St. Petersburg murmured the name like a curse: Rasputin, the mad monk, the charlatan saint, the foul peasant with vodka on his breath and God on his tongue. He had no title, no bloodline, no rank, yet he passed through the palace as if born there. Doors opened, decisions shifted, ministers fell, and all of it, they said, by his greasy, unwashed hand. It was not envy that drove them, it was fear. Russia was bleeding, from the cracks in its frozen soil to the front lines of World War I, where boys died by the tens of thousands in fields too wide to bury them. The empire was unraveling, and at its center stood a man who could neither read policy nor pronounce the names of the cities he now ruled through whispers. This was the unbearable thing, not that Rasputin existed, but that he thrived. And worse still, he was laughing. They watched him stagger from taverns into carriages bound for palaces. They saw his face in brothels, in churches, in drawing rooms thick with incense. He would bless a general in the morning and grope a duchess by evening. His beard dripped with wine, his robes stained from the street. He smelled like a barn. Yet the empress clutched his letters to her breast as though they were scripture. The courtiers were not all noble in motive. Many wanted power back. They resented Alexandra, the German woman, and the weakening Tsar who seemed content to vanish behind her skirts. But their horror at Rasputin was not invented. There were the facts, cold and terrible. He had helped sack Prime Minister Stolypin, one of the few capable modernizers in the government. He installed sycophants in key ministries, men who served not Russia, but Rasputin's approval. He meddled in church hierarchies, demanding his cronies be named bishops. His influence seeped into every organ of state like pus into a wound, yet Nicholas would not see it, or rather, could not. The Tsar, raised in autocracy, believed that to question Alexandra was to question God's plan. And Alexandra, convinced Rasputin was divinely sent to protect her son, saw any criticism as blasphemy. The walls closed tighter. Letters from advisors went unanswered. Ministers resigned in protest. Friends turned to ghosts. Even the Romanov family, ancient and devout, began to panic. Grand dukes met in secret, their imperial blood boiling at the scandal. Some feared revolution, others feared humiliation. All feared that Russia was being ruled not by Nicholas II, but by a monk who could not keep his trousers dry. And still Rasputin rose, untouched, unashamed, his influence growing like a boil in the center of the empire's brain. Rumors became artillery. Pamphlets depicted Rasputin nude, coiled around Alexandra like a serpent. Political cartoons showed him whispering into the Tsar's ear while Russia burned. There were accusations of orgies, black masses, hypnosis. People claimed he had seduced nuns, defiled icons, and committed incest with his own daughter. These were lies. Many of them, but lies spoken too many times, take on a different weight. They become truth in the mouth of a starving crowd. And the people were starving. Food riots erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers returned from the front to find their families dead from cold and hunger. Revolution was no longer a fringe dream. It was a whisper in every factory, every barracks, every breadline. But the Tsar did not act. He prayed. He waited. He refused to dismiss Rasputin. When he finally left for the front to take personal command of the army, another of Rasputin's whispered suggestions, he left the empire in the hands of Alexandra, and thus of Rasputin, to the ministers who remained. It felt like watching a man drown his own children. The empire was now ruled by rumor, by holy dreams, by the flickering rage of a mother guarding her fragile son with the zeal of a fanatic and the mind of a captive. Rasputin did not govern with policy. He governed by instinct. A name would come to him in a dream. A face would offend him. And with a word, careers vanished. It was government by seance, empire as mystic hallucination, and yet he seemed untouchable. Each attempt to remove him politically, reputationally failed. Ministers who spoke out were removed. Police officials who gathered evidence found their investigations buried. The Tsar's own relatives begged him to act, and he would only nod, close his diary, and say, "God's will." The court, once the glittering brain of Russian autocracy, had become a fevered body. Infection set in. The courtiers knew they had two choices: endure Rasputin's slow suffocation of the empire, or take a knife to the rot. They chose the knife, but they did not yet know how deep they would have to cut or how long it would bleed. It is one of the cruel ironies of history that the man with absolute power often has the least clarity. Nicholas II, emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, walked his palace corridors like a ghost in a gilded cage. His crown was iron, but his heart was linen soft, unbending, easily torn. While the empire buckled beneath war, starvation, and protest, he clung tighter to routine, to God, to silence. By 1915, Russia was losing the First World War in both blood and spirit. Millions were dead or wounded. Ammunition was scarce. Infrastructure collapsed. The generals were divided. The people, hungry. The Duma, Russia's parliament, begged for reform, for modern leadership, for competent command. Nicholas gave them Rasputin's whispers. It was Alexandra who begged him to take command of the military himself, to leave Petrograd, go to the front and lead. She called it a sacred duty. Rasputin confirmed it in a letter, telling her that God will crown Nikki's mission with glory. It was a fatal move. When the Tsar left the capital, he left his throne to the wolves. And yet, to Nicholas, it felt righteous. He believed himself a soldier, a shepherd of the nation. He wore his uniform with pride, strode among the men, spoke quietly, firmly. But war is not a theater of faith, and Nicholas was no strategist. His presence at the front did little. The military campaign continued its downward spiral. Loss followed loss. His reputation dissolved with each casualty. Worse still, his absence gave Alexandra, and by extension, Rasputin, unchecked control over the government. The empress, racked by anxiety and religious fervor, fired ministers like a mad queen reshuffling her deck. Ministers of war, interior, transport, none lasted long. Competent men were dismissed for imagined slights or mystical omens, replaced by Rasputin's chosen cowards, fools, flatterers. To the world, Russia was now ruled by a holy drunkard, a hysterical empress, and a czar with his back to the fire. Nicholas recorded it all in his diary with the detached voice of a man watching his own funeral. Weather fine. Walked with the generals. Read Psalms. On the same day, strike shut down Petrograd. Men starved. Soldiers froze to death. But the Tsar was always composed, always numb. His coldness was not malice, it was faith weaponized against reality. He truly believed his power came from God, and that to change course, to listen to elected officials, to dismiss Rasputin, to acknowledge the revolution blooming in the streets, was to betray divine order. Like Louis XVI before him, Nicholas mistook fatalism for virtue. He watched the storm approach and said, "God's will be done." And behind that veil of willful blindness, Rasputin's grip tightened. The courtiers watched in despair. Grand Duke Nikolai, Nicholas's cousin and former commander-in-chief, begged him to return to the capital. The Duma pleaded for reforms. Foreign ambassadors sent desperate letters, warning that the empire teetered on the edge of collapse. But Nicholas refused to hear it. In his eyes, those who questioned his judgment were traitors to the throne. His wife was loyal. Rasputin was loyal. Everyone else could burn. And so the Tsar's eyes grew cold not with cruelty but with certainty. He could no longer see the people and no longer see the land. He saw only duty, icons, and the ghost of his father watching from eternity. The last Romanov Tsar believed that silence was strength, but in truth, it was surrender. And as his people howled in hunger and rage, their sovereign prayed in palatial solitude, staring at the sky, waiting for a miracle that would never come. By 1916, the Russian Empire no longer belonged to its emperor. It belonged to the shadows. It was not a formal coup, nor a sudden collapse, but a slow, cancerous absorption of power by the unseen hand of a man who should never have held it. Rasputin Grigori, son of Siberian soil, was now, in all but name, the most influential figure in the imperial court. And he wielded that influence not with wisdom but with impulse. Ministers who had served their country for decades found themselves dismissed overnight by the whim of a man who couldn't write a coherent sentence. A single whispered slander to Alexandra. He is not a true believer. Or, he looks at you too boldly, was enough to destroy a career. Appointments were made on the basis of dreams and flattery, with Rasputin's favorites replacing seasoned administrators. The machinery of empire groaned under the weight of incompetence, and the shadows thickened. Letters from the Empress to Rasputin, many of them later revealed in scandalous trials, read like psalms and love notes intertwined. She called him my dear, wonderful friend, our guardian angel, the only one who sees. She begged his advice on everything from troop movements to medical appointments. She confessed her fears, her prayers, her isolation. She wrote not like a sovereign, but like a penitent before a living saint. To those outside the palace, this was nothing short of treason. Foreign embassies documented the absurdity that a peasant mystic was dictating policy in a nation at war, that the prime ministers were mere puppets, that the empress, increasingly paranoid and isolated, trusted no one but Rasputin, that the Tsar, miles away at the front, continued to nod and write his daily banalities in his diary while the heart of his empire was bleeding out through invisible wounds. Rasputin, for his part, did not hide. He boasted openly of his closeness to Alexandra. He wandered the streets drunk, kissing icons and maids alike. He bragged to prostitutes that he could remove bishops and install generals, and it was not entirely false. His fingers were now deep in the sinews of power, and he knew it. His face, once ghost-like and gaunt, had grown puffy with indulgence. His robes more expensive, though no cleaner. He was no longer pretending to be humble, he was basking in it. And still, the boy suffered. Alexei's condition remained the silent engine behind all of it. The heir's fragile blood was the reason Rasputin's power was tolerated, clung to. For as long as he could heal the boy, he was untouchable. And when the boy screamed, Alexandra screamed louder. When he bled, her faith in Rasputin deepened. She would not hear of alternatives. She called his critics devils, enemies of Christ, enemies of the family. This was no longer governance. It was superstition masquerading as sovereignty. The empire's elite watched in horror as ministries crumbled. The Duma, Russia's legislative body, was paralyzed. Its leader, Pavel Milyukov, stood before its chambers and cried out what everyone feared to say aloud. Is this stupidity or is it treason? It echoed through the halls like a gunshot. Public confidence vanished. What had once been whispers in salons now roared in the streets. Political cartoons depicted Rasputin as a spider at the center of a web, devouring ministers. Others showed him perched on the throne beside the empress, with a crown of bones and a grin of rot. It was not mere satire, it was prophecy. The monarchy was no longer sacred. It had become absurd, and absurdity is the prelude to collapse. The revolution had not yet begun in earnest, but its seeds were watered daily by the grotesque theater in Petrograd. A peasant prophet lording over nobles, an empress deaf to her people, a czar who had vanished into the fog of war, too stubborn or too broken to return, a kingdom ruled not by law, nor by faith, nor even by fear, but by shadows. And one of those shadows was beginning to stir with a blade in its hand. They could no longer bear it, not the ministers, not the nobles, not the bloodlines that had ruled Russia for centuries, not the sight of Rasputin swaggering through palace halls like a drunk in a church, not the sound of the empress defending him with trembling devotion, not the daily mockery of governance, of tradition, of order. And so they began to plan his death, not for glory, not for justice, but for purification. The killing of Rasputin would be an exorcism, violent, necessary, sacred. They believed they were saving Russia. Among them was Prince Felix Yusupov, young, vain, cultivated, and restless with purpose. He was married to the Tsar's niece. His veins ran with imperial blue and his pockets with ancestral wealth. But none of that mattered now. He believed, as many of them did, that Russia had been poisoned, and the source of that poison had a name, Rasputin. To Yusupov, the monk was more than a man. He was rot personified, a stain beneath the cross, a blasphemy in human skin. He did not want to merely kill Rasputin. He wanted to humiliate him, to expose him, to prove, beyond all denial, that the supposed man of God was a demon wrapped in peasants' robes. The plan was simple in design and grand in symbolism. Rasputin would be invited to the Yusupov palace under the guise of pleasure. He would descend into a gilded trap, beneath chandeliers and mirrors, into a room filled with sweet wine and silent death. They prepared cakes laced with cyanide, wine soaked in poison, enough to fell a bull. But poison, as the conspirators would discover, does not always obey its masters. December 30th, 1916. The monk arrived late, his beard ragged, his eyes wet with madness and warmth. They led him down to the cellar, where a table was prepared with delicate pastries and ornate glasses. Yusupov played the role of nervous host. He strummed a guitar. He made idle talk. Rasputin, unsuspecting or perhaps only pretending to be ate, and ought. The poison did nothing. No trembling, no gasping, no collapse, only quiet chewing and sips of wine. At one point, Rasputin even requested more. The conspirators, watching from the shadows above, began to tremble themselves. Then came the revolver. Yusupov excused himself. He returned moments later, trembling, armed. A single shot rang out. The bullet struck Rasputin in the chest. He collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. The prince felt elation, a grotesque relief. They left him lying there. They celebrated upstairs. They toasted with hands still shaking, until Yusupov returned and found the body gone. In the cold candlelight, Rasputin rose. Blood poured from his side. His eyes rolled white. He staggered forward, one hand reaching, the other clenched. He whispered Yusupov's name. "You bad boy, Felix," and lunged. Panic erupted. The others rushed down. More gunshots. Rasputin collapsed again. Still breathing, still not dead, they beat him, shot him again, tied him, dragged him across the floor like an animal. Blood smeared the marble like a wound opening in the earth itself. They carried him out into the snow, into the cold black air of the Neva. They broke the ice with his body. When his corpse was recovered days later, the findings were almost mythical in their horror. The bindings on his hands were loosed. He had tried to escape. His lungs were filled with water. He had drowned, not died from bullet or poison. His body bore marks of terrible struggle. In death as in life, Rasputin had defied explanation, but the conspirators were not hailed as heroes. The monarchy did not recover. The poison they tried to cut from the body of Russia had already seeped into its soul. The empress collapsed upon hearing the news. She wept, not as a ruler, but as a mother who had lost her only comfort. She declared that Russia would suffer for this sin, and suffer it did. Rasputin's murder was not a cure. It was a final infection. The wound had been opened, but nothing came out. Only silence, only collapse. The shadows had been stabbed, but the palace walls still bled. The monk was dead, but his ghost had only begun to speak. In the weeks following Rasputin's murder, the winter palace fell into a silence colder than any Russian frost. Not mourning for the courtiers had hated him, but something more brittle. A silence of uncertainty. A silence that followed a scream too loud to be forgotten. For Alexandra, but it was catastrophe. She did not just lose an advisor. She lost her confessor, her shield, her salvation. She had trusted in Rasputin with the faith of a medieval saint. His hands had touched her son. His prayers had, she believed, healed the air. Now he was gone. And so, perhaps, would the boy follow? She wrote feverishly to Nicholas at the front, her ink trembling with grief and dread. Our friend has been taken from us. The devils rejoice. The boy grows pale again. She spoke of visions, of curses, of divine wrath, and Nicholas, ever passive, ever detached, responded with his usual softness. He expressed sorrow. He wrote condolences, but there was no action. He would not punish the murderers. He would not avenge the monk. He did what he always did when decisions became unbearable. He waited, but time had run out. The death of Rasputin had not brought clarity. It had brought confusion. The web he left behind, ministries, appointments, rumors, loyalties, continued to function, but now with no center. The decisions made in his name lingered like rot beneath the floorboards. There was no one to untangle the mess, and Alexandra, in her grief, became more erratic than ever. She refused to dismiss Rasputin's chosen ministers, clinging to them as if their presence could conjure him back. She spoke to portraits. She kept his letters near her bed. She whispered to her daughters that Russia had killed a saint, and that the heavens would answer. Outside the palace, the heavens did answer with hunger, rage, and fire. In Petrograd, the people starved as trains carrying food froze on broken tracks. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Factories shut down. Soldiers returned home with frost-bitten limbs and empty stomachs. Their mothers and wives stood in protest, holding signs not of rebellion but of despair. Feed us, our children die. Where is the Tsar, and where was he? Still at the front, still believing, still hoping. Nicholas had become a ghost of monarchy. His generals no longer trusted him. His advisors no longer waited for orders. Even his loyal guards, once fanatics of dynasty, now grumbled by their campfires. The revolution had not yet come, but it was waiting, just outside the palace gates. And inside those gates, paranoia. The winter palace was filled with eyes. Servants whispered in the halls. Ministers looked over their shoulders. Alexandra believed there were traitors in every room. She refused to meet the Duma. She refused to hear news she did not want. She would not even allow doctors to see Alexei without divine approval. She replaced staff daily. The same faces came and went like ghosts through a revolving door of fear. No one felt safe. Not the guards, not the maids, not the daughters of the royal house, who once played in ballrooms and now lived behind curtains cloaked in dread. Even the air changed. The winter palace, once filled with music, light, and opulence, had grown still and gray. Chandeliers were dimmed, curtains drawn, the smell of flowers replaced by the stink of candle wax and old prayers. The Empress no longer hosted receptions. She no longer appeared in public. She had turned inward into mourning, into prophecy, into herself. And so, a nation waited outside in hunger and snow, while inside, the monarchy curled into a fetal silence, muttering holy names and waiting for a miracle that had already drowned in the Neva. This was not the calm before the storm. It was the moment after lightning, when the air crackles with tension and the trees begin to fall. Rasputin's body lay cold, but his death had not restored order. It had shattered the illusion that such a man could be killed without cost, and in his place came nothing. No plan, no leader, no God. Just the gnawing certainty that the empire had no future, and that the blood to be spilled had only just begun. The blood had already dried, the river had already frozen, and yet the story refused to end. They had poisoned him, they had shot him, or they had drowned him. And still, Russia whispered that Rasputin lived, even in death. He was indigestible, refusing to be buried by time, refused by the soil, spat back into the mouths of men who had tried to erase him. The conspirators, instead of heroes, became prisoners of his myth. They had expected salvation. Instead, they were haunted. Prince Felix Yusupov, the architect of the plot, once so composed, began to unravel. He told the story over and over, first to friends, then to newspapers, then to himself. He would weep. He would rage. He described Rasputin's death with ghoulish precision, the look in his eyes, the stench of blood, the impossible rise from the floor, the final crawl through snow. Each retelling grew more feverish, as if Rasputin still clawed at his mind, and perhaps he did. Yusupov became a man possessed. He preserved the clothes he wore during the murder. He posed for photographs with the crime scene. He painted Rasputin's death like a sacrament. But beneath the theater, there was terror, because it hadn't worked. Not truly. Rasputin was dead, but nothing had improved. The Tsar still refused reform. The Empress grew more unhinged. The people still starved. The Duma still shouted into a void. Even the weather seemed to turn against them. The winter of 1917 crept in with unusual severity, cracking the roads, freezing the rail lines, stiffening the very breath of the nation. Frost curled around windows in the capital like skeletal fingers. And behind those pains, people wondered had they killed the wrong man, because Rasputin had warned them. In one of his final letters to Nicholas, penned with trembling prophetic urgency, he wrote, "If I am killed by common men, you will rule in peace. But if I am killed by nobles, your whole family will be destroyed by the Russian people. Brothers will rise against brothers, blood will flood the land, and so he had been killed by nobles, buried by the Neva, and now the prophecy unraveled like a noose within weeks of his death. Petrograd teetered, bread riots surged. Strikes froze entire districts. Soldiers refused orders. The empire cracked in the hands of its God-appointed ruler, and behind it all his face, Rasputin's, not his real face, of course. That had bloated in the river and turned to dust. But the idea of him, he became a symbol not of corruption, but of what had been lost, however grotesque, because in his presence, the monarchy had functioned, even in madness. Now it simply drifted, rudderless and blind, even among the peasantry. Rasputin gained a strange posthumous holiness. They lit candles in his name. They whispered that the Empress had loved him truly, that he had died for her sins, for the boy's pain, for Russia's blindness. Some claim they saw him in visions. Others believed he would return, walking barefoot across the steppe, bleeding from the chest but still smiling. The murder hadn't worked, because Rasputin wasn't just a man. He was Russia's wound, and wounds do not vanish when struck. They pulse, they fester, they spread. Felix Yusupov would live, but never rest, banished, humiliated, tormented by the thing he had tried to kill. The monk followed him to his grave, not in flesh, but in memory, in the eyes of a dying dynasty, in the snow that fell too hard, in the empire that would now begin to die. The gun had fired, the ice had broken, the water had closed, and still he kept crawling. The water remembers. Beneath the frozen crust of the Neva, the current still flowed slow, dark, implacable. It wound its way through the veins of Petrograd like blood under a bruised skin, and in its depths, it carried a secret, the corpse of the man they could not kill. When they pulled Rasputin's body from the river on January 1st, 1917, it was not discovery, it was confession. Russia's filth rose with him. His limbs were contorted, waterlogged. His face bloated, lips cracked and blue. His eyes, wide open, stared at nothing and everything. His mouth was frozen in an unfinished scream, as if drowning had interrupted a final curse. But it was the details that haunted. The bruises around his wrists, raw and torn, showed he had struggled against his bindings. His lungs, filled with icy water, proved he had still been alive when he was thrown in. The cyanide had failed. The bullets had missed the heart. Only the river, ancient and merciless, had done the work that men could not. Rasputin had not died easily. He had died defiantly, a final grotesque testament to his myth. News of the recovery was not celebrated. It spread through Petrograd like a sickness. The press printed it with morbid awe. Foreign ambassadors documented it with disbelief. The people, already starving, did not rejoice, because something had shifted. A nation does not kill a figure like Rasputin and remain the same. It had tried to cut away a tumor and found that the wound would not close. The stench of death did not fade, it thickened. It clung to the cathedral spires, to the frozen rail cars, to the palace windows still lit by candles and fading prayers. Alexandra ordered the body to be buried quickly, but even that could not happen without fear. She chose a hidden location, a military base where few would dare disturb the grave, a small church, an iron coffin. She wanted privacy, reverence, control. But the revolution had other plans. Weeks later, in March, the very soldiers who had guarded Rasputin's secret burial would rise in rebellion. They would open the coffin, burn the corpse, scatter his ashes. They feared even his remains could become a rallying symbol for madness, for monarchy, for myth. They were not wrong. Even in ashes, Rasputin's presence endured. It haunted the palace like a stink trapped in stone. Alexandra was inconsolable. She wrote to Nicholas in trembling script, "They have taken even his grave. His soul remains, but his peace is gone, and with it, ours." Nicholas had no answer. He would never have an answer. The death in the Neva was more than a death. It was the first ritual of collapse, a symbolic murder, a failed cleansing, a warning ignored. With Rasputin's body gone, the monarchy lost what little shield it had left, however diseased. The streets began to boil. The breadlines turned to mobs. The Tsar's own soldiers laid down arms and joined them. What followed was not just political failure, but spiritual disintegration. Russia had drowned its madman in holy water. But nothing emerged from the river but smoke and silence. And still the current moved, under the ice, under the stone bridges, carrying the memory of a corpse that grinned as it sank. The Neva had taken him in, and Russia would never be clean again. The monk was gone, and so was mercy. It began slowly, like rot in the root of a tree. First, rumors, then protests, then the walls began to splinter. By March 1917, just 2 months after Rasputin's murder, the Russian Empire began to collapse, not in blood, but in silence. Trains stopped running, factories shut down, workers poured into the streets. And the Tsar, hundreds of miles away at the front, still believed he ruled. He did not, while Nicholas clung to telegrams and prayer. Petrograd was burning beneath a gray sky. Bread riots became barricades. Soldiers once loyal to the crown now joined the mobs. They fired their rifles not at the people, but at their officers. Regiments abandoned their posts. Police stations were looted. The revolution had begun not with gunfire, but with hunger. And Nicholas, he hesitated. Again, always. He wrote to Alexandra, "The weather is mild. I hear unrest in the capital. But it will pass." It did not pass. It flooded. The Duma, once voiceless, declared itself the provisional government. Bolsheviks whispered in the corners of the uprising, planting the seeds of a second, deeper revolution. But even now, it wasn't ideology that drove the people, it was starvation, shame, fury. They blamed the Empress. They blamed the palace, and they blamed the dead monk who had ruled it all. Rasputin's curse had begun to bear fruit. His final prophecy, written months before his death, had been clear. If your relations are the cause of my death, then not one of your family will remain alive longer than 2 years. The Russian people will rise and destroy you. Nicholas had dismissed it as mysticism. Alexandra had believed it to be divine warning. But now, with the capital in open revolt, the prophecy rang in every corridor like a tolling bell. One by one, the Tsar's allies vanished. Ministers resigned or were arrested. The Imperial Guard refused to fire on the crowds. Even Nicholas's train back to Petrograd was halted by his own army. He was isolated, unwanted, trapped in a vanishing world. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II, descendant of Peter the Great, anointed of God, sovereign of a third of the earth, abdicated. There was no ceremony, no farewell, just a line in his diary, All around is betrayal and cowardice and deceit. The monarchy was dead, and Rasputin's curse had only begun. The Romanovs were placed under house arrest first in the Alexander Palace, then moved east. No more servants, no more velvet, no more God-given titles. Their names were replaced with numbers, their food rationed, their letters censored. They were kept under guard, like ghosts wandering the ruins of their own history. And as they faded, the world changed violently around them. The Bolsheviks seized power later that year. A civil war erupted across the country. The empire, once the mightiest autocracy on earth, was carved into chaos. Famine swept the land, villages burned, cities cracked. Russia was being remade in fire, but far from the front lines, in quiet captivity, the royal family waited. And still, they clung to the belief, especially Alexandra, that Rasputin's spirit would protect them. She prayed nightly, clutching the icon he had once blessed. She whispered his name before bed. She told her daughters, "He walks with us still." But the footsteps outside were not his. They belonged to men with guns. The monk was dead, but his legacy had become prophecy, not of salvation, but of annihilation. They thought they would be exiled to England, perhaps, or some quiet estate in the countryside. Even as the revolution swelled and the guards grew more hostile, the Romanovs clung to the illusion of survival. Nicholas walked the garden paths of their Siberian prison house, still wearing a soldier's coat. Alexandra prayed. The children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei played games, read aloud, tried to laugh. But outside, Russia no longer needed a royal family. None, it needed their absence, their blood, their erasure. By July 1918, the Bolsheviks had grown tired of waiting. The White Army loyalist forces was advancing. There were whispers they might rescue the Tsar, and the new regime could not risk a symbol. Symbols must die. In the early hours of July the 17th, the Romanovs were woken, told to dress, told a photograph would be taken to prove they were alive and well, told to gather in the basement of the Apatiev house. Nicholas stood with Alexei at his side. Alexandra clutched a small pillow. The daughters wore corsets sewn with jewels, hidden in the lining in emergency, a mother's final act of hope. Then the commandant entered, flanked by silent men with rifles. He read a brief statement. "Nicholas Romanov, the Ural Soviet of Workers' Deputies has decided to execute you." Nicholas turned. "What?" And then gunfire. It was not quick. It was not clean. Bullets tore through smoke and silence. Nicholas died first, shot in the chest. Alexandra next. The daughters screamed, confused, unharmed at first. The bullets struck their corsets and ricocheted. The sewn-in gems had become armor, so the executioners used bayonets. They stabbed blindly through the smoke, through screams, through the trembling bodies of once royal children. Alexei, too weak to stand, was shot last, 2 bullets to the head. When it was over, the bodies were stripped, looted, burned. Acid poured over the remain, buried in shallow graves in the forest, unmarked, unmourned. The dynasty had ended not in marble halls, but in a damp basement, with echoes instead of prayers. And yet there is something darker still, because the deaths were not enough. The Bolsheviks knew this. The Romanovs had to be erased. Portraits were destroyed. Records vanished. The very idea of the Tsar had to be ground into the dirt of the new world. For years, the truth was hidden. No one knew what had happened in Yekaterinburg. No graves were marked, no stories told, only silence. But silence, like water, can only be contained for so long. And when the bodies were found decades later, in the crumbling remains of a regime that had itself become brittle, there were questions. Mystics claimed Anastasia had survived. Rumors said Alexei had escaped. Pretenders emerged. The world, unable to bear the horror, invented myth to hide it. But the bones told the truth. The curse had run its course. Rasputin had said, "Not one of your family will remain alive." And now, they lay in earth and ash, every last one, their faces frozen in photographs, their names reduced to whispers, erased from time, not because they were hated, but because they had become too dangerous to remember. When the fire died and the bones were buried, you might think the story ended. But Rasputin would not allow it. The monk who could not be killed, who had drowned with eyes open, who had whispered prophecy into the ears of the damned, he returned not in flesh, but in relic, in memory, in nightmare. In post-revolution Russia, the Bolsheviks sought to erase every trace of the old world. Churches were shuttered, icons defaced. But Rasputin resisted even that. His name lived in secret prayers. His story passed through whispers in prison camps, down bloodlines of the persecuted. He became a folk tale, then a demon, then something holier. When the Soviet Union crumbled under its own rusted weight, the bones of the Romanovs were found. But Rasputin's absence was just as loud. His body wound up burned and destroyed, left no shrine, no grave, only sight, because what remained was his gaze. It peered out from oil portraits and scandalous memoirs. It lived in museum exhibits and apocryphal texts, in photographs. He looks through you, not at you, with those enormous, sunken, fever-bright eyes. The eyes of a man who saw the heart of an empire and smiled as it blackened. To some, he became a martyr. To others, a devil. But to all, he was unfinished. Monks in rural monasteries kept his image in secret. Radical sects declared him a vessel of divine punishment. Academics argued over his role. Was he the final symptom of a dying world or its executioner? His letters survive, scratched and misspelled, full of misshapen grammar and unshakable conviction. They read not like the writings of a man, but the mad scripture of an age losing its mind. God sees all. They can kill the body, but they cannot kill what burns beneath the skin. And indeed, they never could. You can find Rasputin now in wax museums, absurd and caricatured, dressed in velvet and grime, in cartoons, leering, in operas, shouting, in the minds of those drawn to chaos. He is a guide, in the dreams of autocrats. He is a warning. There are rumors, always rumors, that his head was preserved, that his genitals were mummified, passed around in jars, worshipped in secret by those still drunk on monarchy and mysticism, that his spirit still walks the halls of the Alexander Palace, barefoot and wet, humming peasant hymns, that his curse remains unbroken. Of course, none of it is provable, but none of it needs to be, because Rasputin became more than memory. He became a mirror, and when you look into him, you see not a man. You see your own hunger and for power, for faith, for salvation through filth, for the idea that someone, anyone, might hold the thread that binds pain to meaning. His eyes, dark and unclosing, remind us of what we let in when we beg for miracles, and what answers when we scream into the dark. In the end, It was never about Rasputin. Not truly. He was a symptom of fever in the body of an empire already sick with its own mythology. Russia had imagined itself eternal, anointed by God, guided by blood, untouched by the chaos that shattered lesser nations. But beneath the onion domes and golden crosses, the rot had taken root: poverty, repression, hunger, pride. And so it prayed. It prayed for salvation. It prayed for miracles. It prayed for a peasant with holy hands to stop the bleeding of a boy. It got Rasputin, and through him, the old world consumed itself. He rose not through war or conquest, but through wounds. The wound of Alexei's cursed blood. The wound of Alexandra's unbearable love. The wound of Nicholas's passivity. Each allowed Rasputin in, not as a villain, but as an answer. Because in the final days of empires, truth becomes unbearable. And so we reach for something irrational, something grotesque, something holy. And Rasputin gave them all of it. He was a mirror in the flesh. To the peasants, he was hope. To the nobles, corruption. To the Tsarina, salvation. To the Tsar, a silence too deep to confront. And when he died, when they fed him poison and lead and river water, it was already too late. The dream of Russia had died before his heart did. The curse had already taken root. The children were already doomed. The empire already ash. Because Rasputin was never the disease. He was the symptom made visible. We look back now with a grotesque fascination. How could they let it happen? How could one filthy mystic bend a dynasty to his will? Right? But the better question is, why do we always need someone like him in every age of decline, every moment of unraveling? There is a Rasputin, a figure who promises transcendence through chaos, who claims to feel what others cannot, who whispers to power that it need not change, that it is already blessed. That pain is purity, that enemies are demons, that the old ways must hold, even as the ground splits beneath them. And we listen, because in the end, it is not the madman who destroys the world. It is the people who need him to be real. The Romanovs died in a basement, not because Rasputin bewitched them, but because they had no other answers. Their god failed. Their empire failed. Their story ended not in triumph, but in smoke, bullets, and silence. And Rasputin, he smiled from the river's edge, drowned, perhaps, but never erased, because some stories do not end, they echo, like a prayer mumbled in the dark, or a curse that sounds too much like a prophecy.